Hello everyone, if you're watching this video, you're probably wondering, why is this character named Mei in Honkai Impact 3 such a big deal when it's related to Acheron in Honkai Star Rail? Now if you've never played Honkai Impact 3 before, you probably want to know why, just because you're interested or because everybody's making a big deal out of it. So let me explain to you a couple of reasons why it is a big deal from the perspective of someone who actually has played the game. But before I start, I just want to let you know that I won't go too much into detail behind the lore of Honkai Impact 3 because, well, let's be honest, it's very complicated, and if you've never been introduced to the game before, even if I try to explain, you'll probably be lost anyway. So let's just stick to some of the basic ideas. Why is Mei so important in Honkai Impact 3? Undoubtedly, one of the biggest reasons why Mei is so important to everyone who plays Honkai Impact 3 is because of her connection with Kiana Kaslana, the other main character in the story. Now, without giving too much spoilers, basically Kiana is the type that is willing to sacrifice herself for others. And then in contrast, Mei eventually becomes a person that is willing to sacrifice everything else to save Kiana. Or at least that's what she tries to do throughout multiple points in the story. Now, this kind of dynamic that these two characters share is pretty interesting. And as for us, the players, looking into their relationship, we kind of grew up with them from the beginning. And again, Mei is the reason why Kiana ended up wanting to save the world, or at least she had a pretty big part in it. But at what cost?
もしあなたを助けることが罪なら、その罪は私が背負う。
This monologue in the game is probably one of the most important monologues that we remember throughout the story, and it really showcases just how far Mei would go just to save Kiana. So what is there not to like about such a character? A literal badass with the katana, a very responsible and loyal figure, and also the fact that she's literally hot, like she's her share of thunder. But what's interesting about this whole thing is that eventually Mei in Honkai Impact 3 does get somewhat of a happy ending. Now we're not sure 100% yet because the story's not over, but we can still see that she gets somewhat of a happy conclusion because of Kiana and how they saved the world. But let's look across the pond and look at what's going on with Acheron. The first thing we might notice is that there's nobody that's similar to Kiana in the perspective of Honkai Star Rail for Acheron. Basically a figure that Acheron's trying to save or protect. Or maybe they did exist, but then they actually are no longer with us. Maybe that explains the reason why everything about Acheron's lore and her trailers all showcase this kind of feelings of apocalyptic ending or depression. And it's almost like a depiction of parallel storytelling of Mei facing a unfortunate outcome or a butterfly effect. Now with that in mind, if we look at it from the perspective of a Honkai Impact 3 player, it's interesting to see a character that we're familiar with, but the storytelling seems to be in a different way. We know what they symbolize and we somewhat understand their history, but in the world of Star Rail storytelling, it's almost like a theoretical explanation of what could have went wrong in the opposite side of the coin, which is very intriguing, at least for me. Now moving along to the second reason, it's a little bit less about Mei and Acheron, but it's more about the constant world building ideas that overlap with each other between Honkai Impact 3 and Honkai Star Rail. Basically, through Acheron's trailer and videos, there's a lot of information that's given to us not only within the video but also in the description. For example, Kami, or Edict Edge, or the Black Sun. Now, without being too technical about every little detail, I'll just keep it general to break down what all these concepts and ideas mean in relation to both games' lore. And of course, why it's so hype for people who are familiar with the story of Honkai Impact 3. So in Acheron's video, they talk about these things called kamis, or gods. That's what kamis basically mean. And similar in Honkai Impact 3, we have things called the Hershers, which are entities of higher authority. They're basically gods with a lot of power. Now in the description of Acheron's videos, they also talk about a thing called Edict Edge, which is basically a weapon that was created by deceased gods. So in Acheron's version, these weapons or Edict Edges were created by the bodies of kamis that they destroyed. And then with these weapons, they destroyed more kamis and it was like a cycle that was happening. Now in the Honkai Impact 3 world, Edict Edges are basically the reflections of things called divine keys. they're also weapons created with the dead bodies of defeated Hershers. Not to mention, they also talk about the Black Sun in Acheron's video, which is essentially the repetition or the destruction of the world that repeats itself. And this idea in Honkai Impact 3rd is basically the Honkai, a power that is constantly trying to destroy civilization through the cycle of repetition. Now, as you can see, because of so many similarities, people are obviously going crazy over the idea that they are probably related to one another in one shape or form. While it's hard for us to know exactly what that might look like, even though they told us during the livestream that they are somewhat related to one another, until we actually play the story and we understand what's really going on, it's probably hard to tell, but it is pretty exciting with all the similarities, and it's enough to get everybody excited over. Now, another reason why these correlations between kamis or Hershers or Edict Edge or Divine Keys are so important is because after the number 12th kami, the existence of origin and end showcases themselves yet again in both of the game's storytelling. Now, with these ideas in mind, in the world of Honkai Impact 3rd, Mei eventually embodies the concept of the origin. And similarly, in Honkai Star Rail, Acheron is shown embodying the similar concept of origin within her trailer. But what's interesting is that in Acheron's lore, the concept of the end isn't really described much at all. Then when we look at Honkai Impact 3rd, the end is represented by Kiana. Now, if all that flew right over your head, to make it super simple, Mei and Kiana are basically the depiction of the origin and the end that is working together in harmony. And then we look at Acheron's case in this world's depiction, the origin and the end seems to be at odds with each other. And it's very interesting if you think about it, because this concept of harmony and friction probably something that's very closely associated with Penacony as a whole. But as everything else, with the additional ideas of origin and end being showcased through Acheron's story, everybody's obviously excited to see what's going to happen, because after all, Mei and Kiana are the embodiment of the concept of origin and the end in Honkai Impact 3rd. Now, before I forget, I do want to mention one more thing, because if I don't, I know that people will start grilling me for it. Kiana Kasana has a relative basically 50,000 years ago named Kevin Kasana, and obviously they share the same bloodline, which holds a lot of meaning in the story of Honkai Impact 3rd. And again, without giving too much spoiler, this Kevin is also linked with the idea of the end and finality. So we have Kevin Kasana and Kiana Kasana. And one of the cool things that I learned that's freaking everybody out is the fact that Kevin Kasana's voice actor in the Japanese dub is the narrator for Acheron's video. And of course, Mei's voice actor in the Japanese dub is Acheron's voice actor, which I thought was pretty cool after I found out, and I thought it was something worth mentioning with the context of this video. Now, obviously, there are way more reasons why people are so hyped about Mei and Acheron beyond the context of this video. So if you want to learn about Mei or the main story of Honkai Impact 3rd, I have a video series on my channel that I'm working on that recaps the entire story of Honkai Impact 3rd, so make sure to check that out. And if you enjoyed this video, make sure to hit the like, subscribe, and thank you for watching. I'll see you all next time.